welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. The Queen's Gambit was the most watched series in the world last year, breaking all kinds of records on Netflix. More than 62 million households, mine included, tuned in to the 7-part drama. But the backstory of how its executive producer and co-creator finally got it to our screens is, well, pretty much as fascinating as the drama itself. Renowned and revered screen and scriptwriter Allan Scott, best known for iconic films like Nick Roeg's Don't Look Now, Shallow Grave, Regeneration, and the musical version of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, has revealed it took him 30 years and 9 rewrites to get studios on board. The epic drama is based on a 1983 novel by Walter Tevis. It tells the story of a young orphan chess prodigy, Beth Harmon, who makes a name for herself in Cold War-era America as she struggles with addiction in a quest to become the greatest player in the world, challenging the grandmasters of the 60s.
Tell the readers of life how it feels to be a girl among all those men.
I don't mind it. Chess isn't always competitive. Chess can also be beautiful.
So I'm in Alan's offices in London's Leicester Square to hear the story from the man himself. Alan, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you for that. Yes. It didn't take me, I wasn't working every day on it for 30 years. I had to make that clear.
It's good to make that clear. I have actually brought you a little present.
Oh, what's that?
So I've brought you a paperback of the Walter Tevis book with Anya Taylor-Joy
on the cover. I haven't seen
and
that.
The Netflix logo.
Oh, that's marvellous. Oh, good for her.
Tell us, what was it, Alan, that captivated you by the story, which I believe you read in about 1985, didn't you?
Exactly. So I read it fairly soon after publication. I worked a lot with Nick Roeg, the director, and we'd made 5 films together. And one day Nick just said to me, "Here, read this, it's rather good." So I read it, and I immediately knew that I could make it. It was it was like the same thing with Don't Look Now. The ending was so powerful that I knew I had to make the rest to make the ending work. And I felt the same about the Queen's Gambit as I did about Don't Look Now. The ending was what I was really working towards. Anyway, with these 2 great endings, I said to Nick, "I love the Queen's Gambit. Shall we do it?" And he said, "Well, not so quick on the we." And I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Well, I don't think it's my kind of movie. I don't think I can do that. Come up with something else." So I came up with 4 something else's to work with Nick and just wrote the screenplay. I acquired the rights and wrote the screenplay. And the first director I went to was Bernardo Bertolucci. And Bernardo was a wonderful human being. We used to lunch once a month. We'd sit out at the River Cafe, eat good Italian food, and I'd say to him, "Right, now what shall we do? What do you want to change in the script? How do you want to approach it?" "Oh, let's shoot the movie." I said, "Well, no, but directors usually have opinions, and they usually want to do this or that." "No, it's good, we make it a movie." And sorry, I don't mean to do him in a comedy Italian accent.
No, I've interviewed him actually for Stealing Beauty. That is kind of how he speaks, isn't it?
He speaks very well. And he understands.
He's a wonderful character, isn't he?
Great character. So for months, Bernardo said, "Let's just go shoot the movie." Anyway, so I didn't do much work with him on it.
Why did you not end up shooting it with Bernardo?
I lost in the mists of time. Eventually, he found another project called Sheltering Sky, and he went off and made that. And then I was on to Michael Apted. I'm not going to list all the directors.
No, there've been quite a few, and they might be a bit embarrassed now, might they?
No, not really. One was very surprising. I had a lovely couple of meetings with a fellow called Frank Oz who wanted to do it. Frank was the guy who gave you Kermit, and amongst other.
Yeah, I remember that.
Amazing.
The Muppets, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Muppets. I worked with Jim Henson later in my life doing The Witches. I made a movie called The Witches, which for some reason they decided to remake, reset it in America, and I haven't been to see it, but I hope it's horrible. I loved The Witches and persuaded Nick to direct it.
Gosh, we're diversing now. We'll go back to the Queen's Gambit, but how did you meet Nick in the first place? Because I'm looking at a poster behind you, Don't Look Now, with Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland, and that is one of my all-time top 3 movies, I think.
Yes, I love that movie too. That was a project that some hard-working American director said to me and my then partner, we were writing together, would we like to do it? He'd seen something. The first screenplay I ever wrote was on spec. And we sold it to an American producer living in London for £2,000. And that was enough to live on for a year in those days.
It's a handsome sum in those days, wasn't it?
Yeah. And then we watched as he sold it on to somebody else for £12,000. And then that person sold it on to some third party for £50,000. And finally it was sold to the last person who bought it paid £90,000 for a screenplay. And we thought, well, we sold too early, didn't we? So that's how you become a professional writer.
Wow. And what was it like working with Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie, who you still know, I gather?
Oh, I know them both for life. I think you do. Donald they were lovely. They were great to work with. Nick tells the story. I wasn't witness to it, but he tells the story that calling Donald after Donald had read the script and after Nick had offered the role to him. And Donald started saying, but what about this? And do you think that? And could we do? And Nick just said, do you want to make the effing movie or do you want to give me your notes? And Donald said, do you want me to shut up? And Nick said, that would be the best way to get this movie made. I think it's rather a sensible conte morale.
Exactly.
For almost any actor that you have a conversation with.
I think so. So let's go back to The Queen's Gambit.
Yes.
Before we name all the different directors, Bernardo didn't make the film in the end.
No.
But you had discussions with, oh my goodness, one of my favourite actors, Heath Ledger, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, Heath was the last director before we got it made at Netflix. I spotted Heath's talent in a conversation with somebody who'd worked with him, who said, did you know he was a junior champion at chess? And so we had a couple of conversations about the script, but I realized that he not only understood the script, he was really a good director. And I knew this because he showed me in his house in Brooklyn all the commercials that he'd made, all the little, one-man movies that he'd made, and just spoof ads. And you could look at these things and you knew right away, this guy can do it. He's got that gift. So we worked on the script for quite a long time. Huge discussions about how many times we could change the actress. Because the story requires that you see her aged about 6 or 7. But you really need to see her again about 12, 14, and then as an adult. And it was really quite difficult because Heath wanted to have at least one love scene when she was a teenager. And I said, well, if you do that, you can't use the girl that you have playing her at 14 because the spectre of paedophilia hangs over the next part of the movie. So we should have 4 girls playing her, which just seems... And I went to see a Martin Scorsese movie about Tibet. And they changed, what's the leader of the Tibetans called? The spiritual, the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is played, first of all, by a 4-year-old, then by an 8-year-old, then by a 15-year-old, then by a 19-year-old, and then by a 30-year-old. And my wife at one point during the movie turned to me and said, I like this one better than the other one. And I thought, I think she's stepping out of the drama to be able to say that. So I've got to limit the number of times we can see Beth, the girl in Queen's Gambit.
And did Heath agree with you in the end on that?
I think we were agreed. Yeah, we were agreed on the end because we'd agreed the screenplay by then, and then we'd agreed on the number of girls playing it. He was lovely to work with. He was just finishing up Batman. He was one of those few actors who really, really avoided the spotlight when he could, because that kind of fan interaction with a star kind of ruined him as a human being. And he wanted to remain a human being as much as possible because that's where he got his acting inspiration from. And you kind of admire that, which meant that when you went to a restaurant, he sat with his back to the door or the passageway or whatever. So he was a very modest guy. Anyway, he was a lovely person to work with. And he was off in New York for a week. And I spoke to him one night about music, because he didn't know any of the music from the 60s. And I had a couple of crucial songs that I wanted to get into the thing. And we had a little chat about it, and he said, well, I'll listen to the tape again and we'll talk about so-and-so. And the following morning, he was dead. And I was so saddened by it and by the suddenness of it. I suppose all death is sudden, even when people are dying. I didn't really feel I wanted to go on with the project very much. His father contacted me a few times saying we should make this together in memory of Heath. No. Films have their own lives. They don't need to borrow other people's. So I never really engaged with Mr. Ledger. and I let it go for a few years. And then by a wonderful coincidence, an American producer called Bill Horberg, whom I'd worked with, called me up one day and said, "Do you still have that wonderful screenplay, The Queen's Gambit?" And I said, "Yeah." And so I met with Scott Frank, and we became buddies over lunch in Greenwich Village. And it just kind of easily worked from then. And Netflix were a huge addition to the show. I, of course, having only worked on the story in 90-minute terms or 100-minute terms, wasn't sure at first about doing 6 episodes. But actually, I realized that one of the things that I'd said to my friend and director, Nick Rogue, was I wanted to remake Man Who Fell to Earth, which Nick had made with David Bowie. And he rather grumpily said to me, "Well, why do you want to remake that? What's wrong with my version?" I said, "Your version isn't faithful to the book. The book is completely different and it has hundreds of scenes that you should have had in the movie." And then I thought, oh my God, that's probably true of Queen's Gambit as well.
Was it written by Walter Tevis, the man who fell to earth?
Yes.
It was, wasn't it?
Not the movie, the screenplay was the book.
The book
it was his, yeah.
I've never read it.
Well, it's worth reading.
Is it?
Well, look, I mean, Nick's movie was interesting and strange and wonderful. One of the journalists said to him, "Why did you cast David Bowie?" And Nick said, "Think about it. How many actors can play somebody from another planet?" I thought it was a perfectly good answer.
So what was it, Alan, that really held the studios back? Was it the fact that this movie has chess as its centerpiece, if you like?
Entirely. And what they didn't understand, because studios only get access to screenplays when they're read by very young and often very untalented people, and studios get coverage from various people, and the studio coverage basically focused on the game of chess. And what they didn't understand, but would have done if somebody had read the script properly, was that they weren't games of chess. They were emotional and dramatic sequences that were played over a chessboard. You didn't have to know a single thing about chess to enjoy the movie or the series. And that's still true.
You're an orphan, Beth.
I'm fine being alone. I feel safe in an entire world of just 64 squares.
Well, creativity and psychosis often go hand in hand. Or for that matter, genius and madness.
It almost felt to me like they were games of life. There was so much going on in that
Actually,
chess game.
we had Gary Kasparov as our chess advisor, because everybody, well, particularly Scott Frank, who directed and wrote a lot of the episodes, wanted to make the chess absolutely unattackable by chess players. So we had not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 advisors on chess. 2 of them were German champions who were young and were able to hang around 12 hours a day and say, "No, that shouldn't go there, it should go there." One was Gary Kasparov, who read it overnight. And Scott and I met him for lunch the next day. And he made all the right noises and said, "Oh, yeah, this is very good, and you've got it." He said, "There is one thing." Sorry, I do a bad impersonation of a Russian actor.
I like your impersonations. Carry on.
He said, "There is one thing. You have to talk about check and to checkmate. This is never, ever said in real chess championship."
Is it not?
Well, of course it isn't, because the other guy knows where you are and the other woman knows where you are. And they don't need to be told that it's, they don't need to be told that it's check in 26 moves from now.
Because they can see it. They can see it.
Anyway, so with this burden, I thought, well, we've got to be able to tell the audience that she's in trouble or not. So we had to find other ways to do that. I don't think you hear the word checkmate in the course of the movie.
Did you get the actors to learn the moves so that they were authentic, and also for the bits when you were filming the speed chess section, did they learn the actual game so it looked authentic?
The question really is, did Anya learn the game?
Yes.
Yeah. I think the answer is yes. She certainly knows all the moves, and I think actors are good at memory things. She would learn, I suppose, 10, 15 moves in a row. It's not so hard.
Tell me about her as the choice. I found her performance breathtaking.
Yeah.
She is such a wonderful young talent, and her look for it was just, I mean, I know there's costume and makeup all plays a role, but she felt to me like she completely embodied this fictional character of Beth Harmon.
I think she kind of did. I mean, I hope she's not the kind of drug addict that Beth Harmon was.
Yes, that's true.
But she's a wonderful actress. And Scott Frank found her from other things.
She was in Peaky Blinders too,
She was
wasn't
in Peaky
I liked
Blinders.
her in
I think
that.
later, after we'd cast her, that I'm not sure. I never spoke against her, but I thought she was too odd-looking to play that role. And of course, what I'd forgotten and what Scott had seen was that odd-looking was exactly what that needed. I thought she had to be utterly beautiful to look at, but that was just me fantasizing.
But I think she was utterly beautiful in an odd fashion, and actually what attracted me as a woman to her as a female lead was the short fringe and the big eyes and the unusual quirkiness of her appearance.
Absolutely. And by the way, hair, costume, makeup, they all worked with her brilliantly. Because apart from anything else, she had to look the same as an 18-year-old as she did when she was a 12-year-old. The girl who plays Beth in the first whole episode, before Anya becomes Beth, was an English actress who was about 14, I think. I thought she was absolutely brilliant because that was the Beth that was at her most vulnerable. Mother had died, she was in an orphanage, etc. And she was just extraordinary. And the moment I saw her, that child playing Beth, I knew then that Anya was right for Beth as an adult.
When you read Walter's book, as a writer and as a storyteller, what was it about the story that really gripped you and made you think, yes, this is such a good story?
I think it's a Victorian melodrama. It's about the poor little orphan who succeeds over all adversity. I mean, I don't want to give anything away, but what sold me on the book was exactly what sold me on Don't Look Now, a terrific ending. I mean, an ending that you can't imagine what the ending is. It's not a big surprise narratively. It's not anything that you don't anticipate, but it's so beautiful and so resolves her character. And I thought, if I can get people to a point in that ending where they utterly believe in her, then the ending validates itself and the show works emotionally. It's very interesting about how writers always look for the emotional arc in a scene, in several scenes, in whatever parts of the film, first act, second act, third act, whatever it is. We always look for how you use the emotion. It was a very interesting case. I'd written the scene in which Beth goes back to the orphanage as an adult and discovers that the man who taught her chess in the first place has been keeping clippings of all her successful career since then, and they're all in a cupboard. And it's a terribly moving moment. The way Scott shot it, I was either not around, we didn't discuss it. The way Scott shot it, she sees this, we, the audience, see it as well. She leaves the room, she gets into the car that's taking her back to her home, and then she weeps, breaks down and weeps. The way I'd written it, she sees what happened in the room, and that's when she breaks down and weeps. And I thought mine was the better version until I saw it cut together, and his was the better version, because you're waiting for her to weep, and she doesn't, and you think, oh God, is she a tough girl or what? And then she weeps, and it just works very much better than my version.
But then that shows what a great collaboration it is.
No, it is. It absolutely does. Yeah.
I thought the other thing is Berlin proved an amazing backdrop. And the story is set all over the place, isn't it? Russia, Vegas, Mexico, I think.
Mexico, yes.
And yet
and Kentucky, don't forget Kentucky.
And Kentucky, of course. But a large part of the movie was shot in Berlin, wasn't it?
It was all shot in Berlin.
Was it all shot in Berlin?
Well, I mean, there were some shots that other people did. Yeah.
Gave you an amazing backdrop.
It's extraordinary. I mean, Berlin was the best actor in the piece, and there was some fine acting.
There was some fine acting. And what about the costumes as well? Particularly without giving anything away, as the series develops, for me, the costumes were breathtaking.
You know, the whole story is set in the 50s or early 60s. In fact, in one or two of my different drafts with various directors, I wanted to end up with the Beatles' first #1 hit. But we moved it over the period of time a little later than that, so I didn't have that. But Berlin is one of those cities which, as you know, was devastated by the war. And so it could reinvent itself. And it reinvented itself in a kind of brilliant way. And what's happened is the part of the city that was least destroyed is actually now the most fun and interesting part of the city. It's like, anyway, it's like London, except it doesn't have a 17th century quarter. And, of course, the ugliest parts are all the parts that were built after the war in the 50s. But Berlin had to stand in as Soviet Russia in 1960 for us, and it did a jolly good job.
It did a jolly good job. I know you didn't spend every waking hour for 30 years bringing this to Netflix and the screen, but you did spend a lot of time. You took the rights to the book, and over the years you talked to lots of different people about it. What kept you going? What was the drive behind that perseverance?
The absolute certainty that it was a really, really interesting and strong drama. It wasn't arrogance, it was just confidence in Walter Tevis's work. I think the guy's a genius. I think that in time to come, his other books will all be filmed. I think in time to come, Anne Tyler's books will all be filmed. Now, most of us have read at least one Anne Tyler, but the fact is there are about 6 Anne Tyler books that somebody should be making right now. There are writers who have the gift of being translatable into drama, and those are 2 of them.
I'm fairly ashamed to admit that I've never read Walter Tevis, and I've also bought myself a copy, which is in my handbag now, so we'll be reading it. But what I was fascinated to learn is that when he wrote that book, some of it is semi-autobiographical, and he did grow up in a children's home where they gave the children tranquilizers, much like they did Beth in the story. When I was watching it, I suppose as a TV person and somebody who spent a whole career in broadcasting, normally I'm transported by the story, which I was, but I was curious as to the scenes when she's taken the drugs and the chessboard comes to life. How much of a challenge as filmmakers was that for you and Scott?
I think everybody who worked on The Queen's Gambit at every stage of its life, we all recognise the brilliance of the idea of her imagining a chessboard on the ceiling. And particularly, it's fairly clear in the Netflix version of the story that it comes about as a result. I'm not sure if it's any longer it's in the movie or not. In the book, it's when the woman who runs the orphanage bans her from playing chess. And the moment she's banned from playing chess, she comes up with the idea of imagining the chessboard on the ceiling. And we've already established that she can do that because when she's playing with Mr. Shabel, the janitor, and one of his colleagues, she plays the whole game blindfold. You know that I think it was Bobby Fischer who played 50 blindfold games in Chicago, and on the way home by plane, he annotated every single game. I mean, there is a special gift about playing chess. It's not necessarily genius, but it's something that normal people don't have.
Well, when you see how it's played in The Queen's Gambit, you realise that there's a whole art to it, isn't there? And unless you're invested in learning those sequences, you never stand a chance unless you're just playing with your kids at home.
One of the things I enjoyed most was the research in the 80s that I did, going to international and other chess tournaments, because the setup is so wonderful, and finding rooms full of other people with their tiny little chessboards following the game that's being played downstairs by the world chess stars, and the passion that's invested in it, and the leadership, and it's a wonderful world all by itself.
And wasn't there an interesting clause in your contract with this that you couldn't change the game from chess to anything else?
Mr. Tevis was dead by the time I read the book, so I dealt with his widow and her agents. They asked me, would you agree to a clause that you can't change the game? I said, why would I change the game? They said, well, you never know what happens with Philistines. And I said, why would I work for Philistines? But anyway, they were unpersuaded. And I said, yeah, fine. I'm absolutely fine to have a clause in your contract that I am not allowed to change it to ping pong.
So presumably when you took it to Netflix, Alan, it was in your head, it was a movie, I'm guessing, at that point before, no. Did you take it in series form?
We took it, they read the book and one of my scripts, or 2 of my scripts, I don't know. But Scott wanted to do it as a long form, 6 episodes. And I was immediately happy because all it was giving us to do was an opportunity to colour the people involved more.
What happened when you first saw that on TV? Where were you when you first saw the Netflix episode?
I was at Queen Mary's Hospital with COVID for the second time.
Did you think you were hallucinating when it finally went on?
Do you know, I couldn't really tell if I was hallucinating. I thought I was still working on the edit with the director, because nowadays you can send edits to anybody along with a computer. So we spent weeks where Scott would show us the latest cut, and we were allowed to say, well, yes, or why not this, you know. Scott was a wonderful, good collaborator, I'll say that.
No, it's wonderful. It's funny, Alan, I feel very honoured to be here and sitting with you. You know, you've made so many films that have punctuated my life, and I think more than 23 or more feature films, and you're surrounded by posters. We're looking at Regeneration on the wall.
I love Regeneration. Yeah. It's my favourite movie. And I mean, I acquired the rights in that. I wrote that. I produced it with a Canadian partner, and we had a very happy and a wonderful director, Gillis McKinnon, who is an experienced director who hasn't yet made the big breakout movie that he is capable of any day. I loved it because it's my wounded child, because I think it's really, really good and an important movie. It got nominated for Best British Film in its year, but mostly because when we finally got a deal to distribute it in America, the deal was contingent upon changing the title. And when a movie changes its title, it dives from the Premiership into the third division. And there's nothing you can do about it. And it means that a lot of people who should have had access to it didn't have access to it. I mean, it's done okay, and it's sold steadily on DVDs and on downloads. But it's just a movie that I think should have been seen by more people and appreciated by more people.
What are the other ones that really stand out for you? If you were having a cup of tea by the fire, reflecting on some of the highlights of your career, which ones do you look back at? I'm looking at another poster here, Shallow Grave.
Well, Shallow Grave was barely, I mean, I wasn't involved deeply in Shallow Grave, although they very sweetly, after it was done, I executive produced it, but after it was done, they asked me if I would do their next one together. And I said, what's it about? And they said, drug addicts in Edinburgh. And I said, no, not realising that they were geniuses. And I should have said yes.
Yes, exactly.
But I'm fine with that. They were a really good team, and they made a couple of really fine movies. I mean, Danny Boyle is, I guess, England's outstanding director at the moment. And when we see each other, we smile politely.
But which ones does it really stand out
do I like?
For you? Yeah, which?
Regeneration, Don't Look Now, obviously. I love Priscilla, which is not a movie, but I mean, I think anybody who can say they made Regeneration and Priscilla and be the same person is a person I'd be interested to meet.
Well, that's why we are interested to meet you. Now, the other thing that fascinates me is also sitting above your fireplace here is a picture of you sitting on a whiskey cask. I mean, I'm bit fond of a single malt myself, and I gather you were pretty high up at Macallan and Glenlivet in the 70s, late 70s. Am I right, Alan?
I was actually on the board for about 10 years before they made me chairman, or they invited me to become chairman. And I said, look, I don't think I've got any skills in chairmanship. I've never done it. And I'll do it for a year until we recruit a proper chairman. And during that year, I discovered that actually I was quite good at all the skills. They're very small skills. They're like, are you any good at chairing a meeting? The hardest time I had chairing a meeting of any kind was I was chairman of the Writers Guild during that period for a while. And I would think I was the only chairman of a public company who was also a chairman of a trades union. We were allowed, as the Writers Guild, we were allowed to put down questions for the annual trades union conference. Anyway, I asked if I could become the chairman for the workforce at the distillery, but I was told that would be a breach too far.
Would that be a bit of a conflict of interest, maybe?
Yeah.
Was the best bit having to sample some of the...
No, whiskey? The best bit was marketing. I discovered marketing, and I really enjoyed it. I liked all the wheezes and it's bloody hard work. I mean, what is marketing? We had an established whiskey that was maybe the best whiskey in Scotland. And everybody acknowledged it. I asked them to do a campaign for me, which actually we never did in the end, which was to ask every head person of every distillery what was their second favourite malt whiskey.
I love that.
Because I was fairly confident what the answer would be. But the danger was we might not get them to answer the way we wanted. But we did dangerous things. Anyway, so advertising was part of the fun. I loved doing, we had a very limited budget, so we had to do little ads that got attention paid to them.
But that's storytelling again, isn't it?
That's story. It's all story. Well, marketing is about storytelling, really.
Absolutely. And you grew up in Scotland, didn't you, Alan?
I grew up, I didn't leave Scotland except for holidays until I was 18.
Did you go to Gordonstoun as well?
I did, I went to Gordonstoun.
What was that experience like?
It was all right. I mean, Gordonstoun was just a sort of conventional school.
Did you enjoy growing up in Scotland? Do you feel like your roots and your heart are still there?
Yes, I think so. I had a public dispute a few years ago, and somebody said, "Oh, Alan is not really a Scot." And I thought, what does that mean? So I wrote back, I said, Alan's father was Scottish and born in Scotland. His grandfather was, his great-grandfather was, and you will even find ancestors beyond that buried in Fochabers Cemetery. Besides that, Alan went to school in Scotland from the age of 6 or 7. Alan was educated entirely in Scotland until he was 17. Alan runs a large Scottish company, and while running a large Scottish company, he spends more nights in Scotland than a diligent Labour MP. Now tell me where I am not Scottish enough. The answer is that I didn't have a Scottish accent. And there are some Scots that don't have Scottish accents.
I'm from Grimsby and I don't have a Grimsby accent.
There you
but
go.
I'm definitely a Grimbarian.
Yeah, there you go.
And what about your love and your passion for writing? Where did that come from? And when did you realise, Alan, that actually you're pretty good at it?
Thank you. I don't know. You get good at it because it pleases you what you're doing. And I was always good at it at school. It was the only thing I was good at. I had an extraordinary experience about education. I went to McGill University in Montreal because I was going to go to my father's old college in Cambridge, which was John's College, Cambridge. And in those days, if you had 5 O-levels and a father, you had a good chance. And then I discovered that the teaching of English, an English degree in those days at Cambridge, ended in about 1400. So you basically did Anglo-Saxon, early English, Chaucer, and that was about it.
And that was it. You ended with Chaucer. And
I thought, in May I discovered this, and I thought, I can't do that. So I found this university called McGill in Montreal, and they did American literature, modern English literature, French literature. I could do everything I wanted. So I applied, and not only did I get in, I got in straight to the second year. So I didn't have to do all the sort of compulsory exams, which were equal to A-levels, I guess. Anyway, and I absolutely fell in love with McGill, and I did everything that one would do when one falls in love with a university. I enjoy, they have their clubs evening early on in the first term, where you go up and down through the Union Hall and decide what clubs you might like to join. And the first club I joined was called the McGill Outing Club, which in those days didn't mean what it means now. No. It was about going out on weekends on adventures, climbing mountains, rowing across lakes, etc. Anyway, and then I joined a drama club and etc. And, the rest is boring. But I loved writing, and I became... very quickly, I became the features editor of the daily newspaper at McGill. And now, you think a university daily newspaper, well, it was actually printed on the presses of a proper newspaper, so we couldn't go to bed until 3 a.m. when we had the presses available to us. And it had a circulation of about 40,000. So it was a respectable newspaper, about 20 pages. Anyway, I was the features editor responsible for features. And one of the things they asked me to do was to publish each week, and one of the dailies, it was 5 days a week, publish a poem that I liked, submitted by a student. And I came across this poem I really liked, and I published it, and I published it again, and I published it 6 weeks later, and I published it again the next term. And I was hauled up by a committee of the newspaper, and they said, "You're publishing poems by somebody who's not a McGill undergraduate." And I said, "Oh, I'm afraid I didn't realize that. I just got his name. And I published him because I like his poetry." And so they made me stop publishing the works of Leonard Cohen.
Oh my goodness.
And he was there sort of 8 years before me, or 10 years before me, I can't remember.
That's
but they were just wonderful pieces of work.
Gosh, they certainly were. Yeah. Oh my goodness. What are you up to now? I know you're doing a project with Cat Stevens. Tell us a bit about that.
A long, long time ago, I worked with Cat Stevens, or Yusuf Islam as he now is called, were working on a children's book that might have all kinds of various aspects to it, spin-offs into cartoons and animation, all that kind of thing, and various other projects. Yusuf, I asked him the other day, do I call you Yusuf or Cat or Stephen, as I used to call him when I first knew him? He's such a nice man.
Is he?
Yeah. I mean, and, you know, he's white-bearded and occasionally robed, which I find a bit distancing. But I really enjoy working with him. He's bright and he's kind of back in the world. He's done a new album. There we are. Anyway, so I'm doing that with him. I'm doing a couple of musicals, at least two. One of which I'm really looking forward to is about the Second World War. And it's really an attempt to educate everybody under the age of 60 about roughly what happened in the Second World War, using only the music that was enjoyed in the period 38 to 46. I had to go to 46 because there were a couple of songs in 46 that I liked better.
Gosh, that's amazing. So you must really love the research that goes into that.
I certainly know every song that was ever written or enjoyed, yes.
And is that really pleasurable listening?
I've absolutely adored it. And what's really pleasurable is that hopefully I'm going to co-arrange it, and you change everything. I mean, when I did Priscilla, the songs come in a different context, and because of that, then the arranger sits there and reinvents them, as it were. I mean, MacArthur Park, which is one of the big songs in Priscilla, it works better than I've ever heard MacArthur Park work, because all the people who sing it have an emotional life that the audience is following. And so this burst, Colour My World, the same thing. Those songs, and anyway, I'm hoping to do the same thing with World War II. But I had a real problem. I couldn't find a song for the company or for somebody to sing after one of my leading characters dies in a London bombing raid. Because you can't have somebody go off and sing, I loved her. I mean, it's too shallow and too glib. And I took a long time finding it, but it's why I stretched to 46. The song that the bereaved person sings can be told, you can know what it is from the title. Spring will be a little late this year. And the moment you hear that, you think, oh, that's a really good emotional song to say. Anyway, there we are. And so the show is full of those, and we got a lot of interest in it, so I'm hoping I get it up before the end of next year.
It's clear, looking at your eyes and your hands and the way you're so animated when you talk about your work, that you love what you do. How do you switch off, Alan? Or perhaps do you not switch off?
I read a huge number of books for my work, so it means I don't read that much for pleasure any longer. I have readers who help me, and I find them very useful, who, professionally look at screenplays and look at novels, give you an analysis of them. They're really useful. In fact, one of my current readers, I'm about to offer to write a screenplay for me.
Gosh, that's amazing.
Well, it's just because you can see that his thinking goes along the same lines as yours approximately. So let him have a try,
And do you ever get back to Scotland these days? Do you still have a little
much less
space?
Than I used to. I gave up in 1 year 5 public bodies that I was running in Scotland. And I gave up 6 commercial companies that I was on in Scotland.
Do you still get up to Scotland for pleasure?
I do. Well, I'm on a couple of university bodies, and I do that. And I go up for pleasure. I have a home up there. I go up less than I did simply because I travel to the States a lot. There's not as much opportunity. Also, I'm not a real Scot because I don't have a Scottish accent.
No, of course you're not a real Scot, and I'm not a real Grimbarian. I tell you what, it's been an absolute joy sitting here today and having a little whiz through some of your career, and also hearing the story behind the Queen's Gambit. I mean, forgive us for being so fascinated, Alan, but it was such an amazing series, and it's great to hear. The story behind it is pretty much as fascinating, isn't it?
I must tell you, I really like Netflix. When I was ill, out of the blue, I got a bunch of flowers and a note from the chairman of Netflix, whom of course I'd never met. It's a multi-billion-pound corporation, who somehow noticed that I was in hospital with COVID and sent me a commiseration note. I like a company that does that.
I like a company that does that, but he must like you too, because you've broken all kinds of records for his company. So I'm sure the feeling's mutual, I'm guessing.
I hope so. Anyway, they were very nice, and they sent me a large check when we won the Emmy.
Did they?
Yes.
Oh, we like large cheques, don't we? I hope it was more than £2,000.
It was.
Good.
Why is £2,000 your yardstick?
Because we were talking about £2,000 earlier, weren't we?
Oh, when I was a young man.
Yeah, you've got a bit more expensive than that these days.
By the way, that's something. We should ensure that all universities run competitive courses with cash prizes. I won a prize in my second term of $2,000, which transformed my life. It meant I could actually date a girl. It meant I could go to a movie, which I couldn't do prior to that prize.
Well, you should start it.
Now on a university body, I'm on a committee where we just come up with a new thing where we discovered that children who have had care tend to do less well at university than others. And we investigated as to why. And it turns out that it's a lack of cash. They don't have them, they're brought up by an adopted family or whatever, and they don't have the cash to pay for the accommodation or the food. And so we now have a pan-Scottish initiative to help people who are from care of any kind.
Pan-Scottish, even though you're not Scottish. Alan, thank you so much for your time. I could chat away to you all day, but this is perfect podcast length, isn't it? Maybe we'll have to do a part 2 at some point.
I think we should start making whiskey in Grimsby.
I'm with you. I'll help you with the marketing and the tasting.
You're not Grimsberian enough.
Thank you very much. You've been listening to screenwriter and producer Allan Scott, sharing the extraordinary backstory to finally getting the Queen's Gambit made after 3 decades, not every day, of trying, which millions of us, of course, have enjoyed now all over the world. Do download our series at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I'll be back next week with another great guest. Do join me then.